The problem about discussions of this kind, where you tend to divide up an area of discourse into sort of two dichotomous paradigms, sometimes has a very bad influence on that area, because it tends to be sort of agenda setting, agenda dominating, and people feel that there isn't very much conceptual space left. So when you're discussing these issues, you tend to think you have to be able to fit a particular position into either one or the other of those two dichotomies. Which in the case of Wittgenstein, for example, isn't particularly helpful, because he tries to locate himself outside of the realism, anti-realism debate. In fact, I think what's revolutionary about his philosophy in general is that he challenges the preconceptions that make us want to, as it were, divide the debate up into either realism or anti-realism. So to a certain extent, the debate makes sense, in the sense that we can argue about realism and anti-realism, but that's not to say that these are necessarily the preferred options, the ones you ought to go for. And indeed, you ought to be sort of able to consider whether those two options really exhaust the available space. And if you follow Wittgenstein, you ought to end up concluding that there's more out there than just those two ways of conceiving things. I mean, I personally think Wittgenstein is not promoting any kind of anti-realism, because he's not arguing that there is no such thing as the reality of God for a religious believer. So he's not saying that if you are a religious believer, you don't really believe that there is a God. What he's asking us to do is to consider what saying that amounts to, and that we shouldn't model sort of concepts in one area of discourse, say religious language, on a completely different area, let's say ordinary empirical discussion. So as in his philosophy more general, what Wittgenstein is doing is, if you like to use this quote from King Lear that Wittgenstein himself was quite he liked that very much, "I'll teach you differences." Wittgenstein's very much against trying to reduce everything into one way of looking at things. So you're not supposed to think that the concept of God necessarily functions, for example, like words for ordinary empirical objects, and the way classically for example, people like Richard Swinburne still think of God as being kind of an object among all the other objects in the world. It's just that God is particularly distinctive. He has amazing features in contrast to all these other objects. And what Wittgenstein would say about that is that in a way you're getting confused by the surface grammar here. You think, because you can say God does X in the way that you can talk about ordinary objects behaving in certain ways, it makes sense to do that in the case of God, but it might not always make sense. For example, we talk about people having eyebrows. We all know what that means. But even though we say the eye of God sees everything, we don't talk about God's eyebrows. So there are some similarities in grammar between ordinary talk and religious language, but then those similarities kind of break down somewhere. And Wittgenstein thinks that ought to alert us to the fact that something different is going on, that there are subtle changes of meaning when you move from ordinary contexts to religious contexts. But that's not to say, by saying that, Wittgenstein has no wish, it seems to me, to undermine the idea that for religious believers, God has a reality. The question is, what does reality mean in that context? And again, God is perhaps real in a somewhat different sense to sort of, tables and chairs being real.